Welcome to our presentation. Our topic is Management and Government Boards. I'd like to introduce our team. Rob, Leslie, Yvette, Katie, and myself, Roxanne. We've enjoyed looking at governance from many angles and will focus our discussion today on three main types of organizations that use governance. Graham, Amos, and Plumtree noted that governance is not only about where to go, but also about who should be involved in deciding and in what capacity. What we found as we deepened our discussion on the topic of governance is that variations in ownership and accountability within an organization are distinct factors in the governance of for-profit, not-for-profit, and public military organizations. For instance, in the private sector, revenue is the clear driver of success, whereas the collective good or shared interest forms the unifying foundation of most public and not-for-profit organizations. Let's take a closer look at governance from those three perspectives.
When you think of companies such as Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom, what comes to your mind? Is it the legacy of a great company honored by the likes of Jim Collins and work such as Good to Great? Or is it the story of greed and corruption? Unfortunately, many stories end in the latter, which leaves us wondering how such actions could occur under a governance structure that was designed to mitigate such behavior. As described by Miller in her 2002 article, The Board, a Monitor of Organizational Activity, the dominant theory governing board practice is agency theory, which is based on the underlying assumption that the agent or CEO of an organization would act in their own best interest if left to their own accord. As such, the board creates a balance of power, if you will, which ultimately protects the collective interest of the common shareholders.
Rob, I can't help but hear your skepticism in these types of statements. I got a sense that agency theory really points to the management of expenses, which is important in the performance of any not-for-profit. Miller-Millison asserted that agency theory and resource dependence theory are complementary when used to predict and explain board behavior. Essentially, these two theories work together to make up both the revenue and expense side of an organization's balance sheet.
Thanks, Katie. And actually, one of the articles that we looked at, the Harvard Business Review article, What Makes Great Boards Great, Sonnenfeld provides a very interesting analysis into the challenges and relevance of common board structural practices related to rules, procedures, and the board composition. As Sonnenfeld suggests, although structure and accountability are important aspects of governance, the human elements are what truly makes the board great. These are creating a climate based on respect, trust, and candor, fostering a culture of open dissent, utilizing a fluid portfolio of roles, ensuring individual accountability, and evaluating the board's performance. Leslie, what does governance look like in a public or military organization?
Great question, Rob. The purpose of a democratic government is to balance society's wants and needs based on priorities set by its people through the electoral process. As the global community includes more organizations and as the scope of society's problems, such as the environment, global security, and financial instability expand, interorganizational cooperation is essential for success. This is done through the establishment and maintenance of cross-sector regimes of mutual gain. Leaders of these regimes need to understand the governance structures of each represented sector or organization. This is necessary to establish processes for decision-making, communication, and accountability that will work for all participants, as well as organizing the collective body in such a way as to best satisfy the needs and goals of the partnership. This governance sets up the criteria for success and will vary depending on which players are involved. Working with all these different sectors can be a challenge. Yvette, do you see any definable differences or similarities that can help us understand how they might interact?
Yes, Leslie, thank you. I would like to start talking about the similarities. One of the most important features that is common among private, public, and not-for-profit organizations is the social systemic condition. Other common aspects among these different types of organizations include having a mission, vision, values, and a common purpose. All three sectors, public, private, and not-for-profit, create public value, but they do so in different ways. Let me now talk about the differences. While not-for-profit and public sectors strive to maximize services while minimizing overhead costs, private organizations work to maximize profit. Not-for-profits work to fill social gaps not covered by private and public sectors. The government works to provide services only for areas that cannot be satisfied by the not-for-profit and private sector in order to reduce the amount of taxes needed from the public. The differences we identified are a consequence of the nature of the interests and also include the ownership and commitment from the board.
Thanks, Yvette, for defining those similarities and differences. In the first organization I worked for, our staff team, that is, everyone that worked below the executive director, successfully got the attention of the board to share information regarding the executive director's poor management practices. An internal HR audit was commissioned by the board, resulting in the executive director's removal. However, the replacement executive director had no experience in not-for-profit management or organizational leadership and was less equipped for the position than their predecessor. Too often, well-intentioned boards are left without the required knowledge and support to make effective decisions. I wonder if public and military organizations face the same challenges in their governance. What has your experience been, Leslie?
Thanks, Katie. Delving into the world of governance for me was like diving blind into a dark ocean. From the surface, I couldn't pick out any definable pieces of my organization that I could associate with governance. But once I submerged myself into the readings and my colleagues' analyses, I began to see the underlying structures and hidden nuances that shape how the military operates within the public sector. The military has very clear processes and a defined hierarchical structure, but it cannot operate independently and still be effective. Looking closer, I observed the informal, horizontal networks and regimes of mutual gain that were established to solve problems, create policy, and to maintain standards within my organization, across the military, and across the whole government. Each of these networks had governance of its own, but not neatly recorded where I could read about it. It was in the traditions, norms, expectations, and the customs of the military. Do you have any examples in the public sector, Yvette?
Yes, Leslie, thank you. I'm going to talk about an experience in Citigroup that happened in 2001, in which Citigroup acquired Banamex for $12.5 billion. When the transaction was concluded, there were two boards and all the functions were duplicated, as well as the policies and procedures. People from both banks were very confused about what to expect. There was a need to establish a governance contingent model to facilitate the merger process. A task force defined more than 300 tasks that included massive layoffs, a new board, core processes, authority delegation, and the selection and retention of key talent. In parallel, there was a group in charge of working with the cultural aspects to define common values, principles, and integrate a group that was ultimately going to be of 40,000 employees. The learning from this experience was the opportunity to see what happens when there is not a governance model in place. The second learning from this experience was the importance of taking into consideration the establishment of contingent structures and governance models during a severe crisis or transition.
Despite the similarities of governance across the sectors reviewed, it is clear that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Where for-profits have formed governance to protect capital assets, nonprofits and public entities have pursued similar structures to provide a balance of power. What is common is the need for a clear accountability and ownership structure, as all organizations, independent of sector or cause, requires clear focus and shared accountability.